I knew something was off when I found the first pile of broken branches scattered across my driveway. It wasn't just a few leaves here and there. It looked like someone had taken a pair of shears to my hedge and gone to town on it. My heart sank as I looked at the destruction. Who would do this? And more importantly, why? I glanced around, but the street was quiet. Just the usual suburban calm, where people pretended they weren't secretly watching each other from behind their curtains. But someone had done this and I was going to find out who. At first I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was an accident. A freak windstorm? A rogue animal? But deep down I knew better. I had spent weeks shaping that hedge, making sure it was the perfect natural barrier between my yard and the street. It was my pride and joy, and someone had deliberately butchered it. The worst part? It wasn't the first time. Over the next few weeks it kept happening. Sometimes whole sections would be missing, as if someone had taken a saw to it in the dead of night. Other times, there were deep, jagged cuts that made it look like my hedge had been in a knife fight. I installed a camera, thinking I'd catch some teenager playing a prank, but what I found made my blood boil. There she was, Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, standing in my yard at 2 a.m, hacking away at my hedge like a deranged gardener. She wasn't even trying to be discreet. Dressed in a bathrobe with a flashlight clenched between her teeth, she snipped and yanked branches like she was pruning her own personal nightmare. I watched the footage in disbelief. This wasn't just some petty complaint. This was personal. I had met Karen exactly twice before this. The first time was when I moved in and she showed up unannounced to welcome me while also listing all the HOA rules I was apparently violating within the first hour of living there. The second time she knocked on my door just to tell me my trash cans were an inch too far from the curb. She was the kind of person who thrived on power no matter how small, and the HOA had given her just enough of it to make life miserable for everyone. Now she was literally trespassing on my property and destroying my hedge. I took the footage to the HOA, thinking surely they would do something about one of their own members blatantly breaking the rules. But the moment Karen walked into the meeting, the entire room shifted. The other board members exchanged nervous glances, and one of them cleared his throat before awkwardly explaining that there was no concrete proof it was her. I stared at them. You can see her. Right there. The scissors. On my property. One of the board members rubbed his temple. It's unclear if this footage was taken within proper HOA surveillance guidelines. Karen sat across from me, arms folded, wearing a smug little smile. Oh, I was simply trimming some overgrown branches. You should be thanking me for keeping the neighborhood looking nice. I gritted my teeth. You destroyed half my hedge. He shrugged. It was an eyesore. That's when I realized exactly what I was dealing with. Karen wasn't just annoying. She wasn't just some overzealous rule enforcer. She was a tyrant, and the HOA was too spineless to do anything about it. Fine. If they weren't going to help, I'd handle this myself. The next night I reinforced the hedge with a trick I'd read about online. Thorn bushes. Perfectly legal, perfectly natural, and perfectly painful if someone tried to cut them down. I went to bed satisfied, picturing Karen lunging at the hedge with her scissors, only to realize, too late, that she was covered in tiny stabbing thorns. The next morning I walked outside with my coffee, pretending not to notice Karen shaking out her hands and muttering under her breath as she stomped past my yard. Success. But Karen wasn't the type to back down. A few days later I got a notice in my mailbox. HOA violation. Unapproved landscaping modifications. I nearly laughed out loud. Karen was now trying to fine me for fixing the hedge she had been destroying. I stormed into the next HOA meeting, documents in hand, ready for war. My hedge is legal. The property line is clear. You have no right to fine me for something I'm allowed to have. Karen tapped her pen against the table, feigning concern. We're simply ensuring consistency in the neighborhood. Some residents have expressed complaints about the hedge's appearance. I scanned the room. Who exactly has complained? Silence. Then one of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Karen smiled. Anonymous complaints, of course. I clenched my fist. He had just made them up. She was making the rules as she went, and the HOA was letting her. I had played fair. I had followed every rule. But now it was time to play smart. I spent the next few weeks carefully preparing my revenge. I learned Karen's habits, her routines. Every morning she parked her oversized luxury SUV right next to my hedge. Every night she walked past it looking for new reasons to make my life miserable. So I set my trap. The first part was subtle. I tweaked my sprinkler system, adjusting it so that it sprayed in a fine mist just over the hedge. Then I created a special solution, totally harmless to plants but absolutely devastating to car paint. A little homemade mix of sugar water and mild adhesive. Virtually invisible when wet but under sunlight, it turned into a sticky nightmare. All I had to do now was wait. The next morning I watched from my window as Karen strutted up to her SUV, reached for the handle and froze. I could almost hear the gasp from inside my house. Her hand stuck. She yanked it away, staring at her fingers in confusion, then turned her gaze to her car. Slowly, as the sun began to rise, the truth revealed itself. The once pristine surface of her precious SUV was now covered in a patchy, streaky mess. The paint had started peeling in long, ugly strips, as if the car itself was shedding in horror. Karen's scream echoed down the street. I took a sip of my coffee, enjoying the sight. And this was just the beginning. Karen's scream that morning was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was like a symphony of karma playing just for me. I casually stepped outside, pretending to stretch as I watched her inspect the damage to her once pristine SUV. The paint had started peeling in long, ugly strips, and her fingers, still slightly sticky, were smeared with the residue of my carefully crafted revenge. She frantically rubbed at the car as if sheer willpower could reverse what had happened. But the more she wiped, the worse it got. The sun had done its job perfectly, baking the mixture into the surface and ensuring her luxury vehicle now looked like it had been left in a junkyard for a decade. She spun around suddenly, eyes locking onto me. "You," she shrieked, marching towards my yard. I raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "Morning, Karen. Something wrong?" She pointed a shaking finger at me, her face red with rage. "Don't play dumb. You did this." I glanced at her SUV, rubbing my chin thoughtfully. "Huh. That's some serious damage. You sure you didn't park under a tree full of angry birds?" Her nostrils flared as she jabbed her finger at my hedge. This thing. It's responsible." I folded my arms, enjoying every second. "By Hedge? How does a plant damage a car? Are you suggesting it's sentient?" Karen let out a frustrated growl and spun around, storming off toward her house. I knew she wasn't done. Karen was the type of person who didn't take losing lightly. She would go to any length to make sure she got her revenge, and I had no doubt she was already plotting. 2 days later, I got another notice in the mail. HOA violation. This time the fine was even bigger. Intentional property damage to neighborhood aesthetics. I nearly laughed out loud. She was trying to frame me for the destruction of her own car. I walked over to her house, notice in hand, and knocked. She opened the door with a smug look as if she had already won. "Nice try," I said, waving the notice. "But you're going to have to do better than this." Karen crossed her arms. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you can just do whatever you want." I leaned against her porch railing. "Oh, I don't think, Karen. I know. And I also know you have no proof that I did anything to your car." Her eye twitched. "You've been harassing me since the day you moved in." I laughed. "That's rich, coming from the person who's been vandalizing my hedge for weeks." She smirked. "Prove it." I wanted to wipe that expression off her face, but I knew this battle wasn't over yet. She was going to keep pushing, keep trying to get me kicked out of the neighborhood or fined into oblivion. But I wasn't about to back down. If she wanted a war, I was happy to give her one. I started digging into HOA policies, looking for any loophole, any rule that I could use to my advantage. I found something interesting buried deep in the fine print. An old clause stating that any HOA member caught intentionally damaging another resident's property could be removed from the board. I needed proof, though. My camera footage wasn't enough since the HOA was in Karen's pocket. I needed something undeniable, something she couldn't talk her way out of. So I set my second trap. This time I installed small, almost invisible fishing lines near the hedge, placed just at ankle height. Not dangerous, but enough to make someone stumble. Then I spread a fine layer of powdered dye over the area, completely invisible in the dark but guaranteed to stain anything it touched. Finally, I repositioned my security cameras to get a full, clear shot of the entire scene. And then I waited. Karen was predictable. I knew she wouldn't be able to resist trying to mess with my hedge again. Sure enough, at around 2 in the morning, I heard a faint rustling outside. I peeked through the window and saw her in her usual ridiculous outfit. Bathrobe, slippers, flashlight clenched between her teeth. She stepped toward the hedge, scissors in hand, and then, bam! Her foot caught on the fishing line, sending her sprawling forward. She landed face first in the dyed powder, flailing and kicking up clouds of the stuff as she tried to scramble to her feet. It clung to her bathrobe, her hair, her face. Every inch of her was now coated in a fine bright blue haze. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing out loud. She finally managed to get up, coughing and swearing under her breath, and staggered back toward her house. But not before my cameras caught every second in crystal clear detail. The next morning, I walked straight to the HOA office and submitted the footage along with a formal complaint. I made sure to emphasize how much of a security concern it was to have a board member trespassing and destroying property. By the afternoon, word had spread. The HOA held an emergency meeting, and for the first time, Karen wasn't the one in control. The other members had no choice but to review the evidence, and no matter how much she tried to argue, there was no denying what they were seeing. Her reign over the HOA was crumbling. I sat back and watched as the board members whispered among themselves. Finally, one of them cleared his throat. "Karen, this is deeply concerning. Given the circumstances, we're going to have to temporarily suspend your position on the board while we conduct a formal review." Karen's face turned an unnatural shade of red. "You can't be serious. I built this HOA. You can't do this to me." One of the other board members sighed. "Karen, the footage is undeniable. You've been vandalizing property, trespassing, and frankly abusing your position. We have no choice." Karen turned to glare at me, pure venom in her eyes. "This isn't over." I smirked. "Oh, I know." She stormed out of the meeting, but I knew she wasn't done. Karen was like a wounded animal, dangerous and unpredictable when cornered. That night, I reinforced my hedge once again just in case. And then I prepared for the final round of our little war. Karen had been playing dirty from the start. But now it was my turn to finish this once and for all. He said. Karen was a woman who thrived on control, and losing it was not something she could accept. After being suspended from the HOA board, she went unusually quiet. No dramatic confrontations, no fake complaints, no HOA violation notices mysteriously appearing in my mailbox. It was unsettling. Karen didn't just accept defeat. She was the kind of person who plodded in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. And that made me uneasy. I kept my cameras running, my hedge reinforced, and my eyes open. But for days nothing happened. It wasn't until I woke up one morning to a loud bang outside that I knew she had made her next move. I rushed to my front yard and stopped dead in my tracks. My hedge was gone. Completely. Not just trimmed or damaged like before. It had been ripped out at the roots. A few stray branches were scattered across my lawn, evidence of what had once been a perfectly healthy, legal, and well-maintained barrier. The ground was raw, torn up, as if someone had come in the middle of the night with the sole intention of making sure there was no trace left. I clenched my jaw, my blood boiling. This wasn't just petty revenge. This was war. I stormed over to Karen's house, knocking so hard on her door that it rattled. After a few seconds, she opened it, her expression a carefully crafted mix of fake surprise and barely concealed smugness. "Oh my," she said, feigning innocence. "Something wrong." I held up a handful of the ripped branches. "You want to explain why my hedge is missing?" She let out a dramatic gasp. "Oh dear. Was there a storm last night? Maybe it got blown away." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Cut the act, Karen. I know you did this." She shrugged, crossing her arms. "Prove it." I gritted my teeth. I already knew the HOA wouldn't do a thing without solid evidence, and Karen knew it too. She had covered her tracks well this time. No cameras had caught her in the act. No footprints leading back to her house. Just an empty space where my hedge had been, and a woman standing in front of me who was enjoying this way too much. I turned away without another word, but in my mind, I was already formulating my next move. Karen thought she had won, that I would roll over and accept defeat. But I was done playing by the rules. That afternoon I went online and made a few special purchases. If she wanted to escalate, I was happy to escalate. 2 days later, a delivery truck pulled up to my house. The workers unloaded everything I had ordered, and I wasted no time getting to work. If Karen thought she was getting rid of my hedge permanently, she was in for a nasty surprise. By sunset, my property line was lined with something new. Something bigger, stronger, and 10 times more irritating for someone like Karen. A full row of 6-foot-tall, thick wooden privacy fences, legally installed and completely within my rights as a homeowner. When Karen walked outside the next morning and saw it, I thought for a second her head was going to explode. She marched straight to my yard, face red with fury. "What the hell is this?" I smiled, sipping my coffee. "Oh, just a little home improvement project. Since my hedge mysteriously vanished, I thought I'd upgrade." She looked at the fence like it personally offended her existence. "You can't do this. This ruins the entire look of the neighborhood." I shrugged. "Actually, I can. The HOA guidelines state that fences are allowed as long as they don't exceed 6 feet and maintain proper spacing. And look, mine is exactly 6 feet, perfectly legal." He was fuming. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" I leaned in slightly. "No, Karen. I know I am." For the first time since this war started, Karen had nothing to say. She turned on her heel and stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard that I was surprised her windows didn't shatter. But I knew she wasn't done. She had one last move left and I was ready for it. The following week I got a notice in the mail, an official summons to an HOA hearing. The charge: deliberate obstruction of neighborhood aesthetic integrity. It was Karen's final attempt to take me down. She had pulled every string she had left, called in every favor, and convinced the board to hold a meeting to determine whether my fence was a violation of HOA standards. I walked into that meeting with my head held high, documents in hand. Karen was already there, sitting smugly at the front like she had already won. The HOA president cleared his throat. "We are here today to discuss the complaint regarding the new fence installation at Mr. Mark's residence." Karen leaned forward dramatically. "This fence is an eyesore. It destroys the harmony of our neighborhood's open design." I remained calm. "Actually, I have here a copy of the HOA's own guidelines." I placed the documents on the table. "As you can see, my fence meets every single requirement. It is within height regulations, color guidelines, and spacing limitations. There is absolutely nothing in these rules that states I cannot have it." The president looked over the documents, frowning slightly. One of the other board members murmured something to him, and I could see the hesitation in their eyes. Karen, sensing her grip slipping, stood up. "This is outrageous. He has been nothing but a nuisance since he moved here. He vandalized my car, he set traps, I cut her off. "Speaking of vandalism." I pulled out my final card, the HOA's own security footage from a nearby street camera, the one Karen had forgotten about. I had done my research and found that one of the neighborhood's traffic cameras had captured her dragging large garbage bags filled with what appeared to be hedge clippings on the night mine disappeared. I turned the screen toward the board, playing the footage. Karen's face went pale. The room went silent. The HOA president looked up at her, his face stony. "Karen, this is very concerning." Karen stammered. "That doesn't prove anything. Maybe I was just cleaning up my yard." I tilted my head. At 2 in the morning? Dragging trash bags from the exact area where my hedge was destroyed. The president sighed heavily. "Karen, you have repeatedly been at the center of complaints regarding property violations and harassment. Given this new evidence, we are left with no choice but to remove you from the HOA board permanently." Karen shot up from her seat. "You can't do this. This is my neighborhood." The president adjusted his glasses. "Not anymore." She turned to me, pure hatred in her eyes. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" I smiled. "I don't think, Karen. I know." The vote was final. Karen was officially out of power. Without her authority, the complaints stopped, the ridiculous fines disappeared, and the neighborhood finally had some peace. A few months later, a for sale sign appeared in Karen's yard. She was gone by the end of the summer. The morning after she left, I stepped outside with my coffee and looked at my perfectly intact fence. The battle was over and I had won. And for the first time since I moved in, the neighborhood actually felt like home.